sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. On today's show, we are diving headfirst into the subject of relapse. Now, relapse is something that I imagine anyone who has been through even the slightest degree of substance addiction knows at least a thing or two about. But for those of you who are not familiar with what relapse is, in the context of drug abuse and addiction, relapse occurs when a patient is trying to stop using a substance and makes the mistake of using the substance again. Pretty simple. Now, this can happen for a variety of reasons, and in fact, relapse is probably the number one reason as to why most patients beat themselves up, or even worse, give up on recovery from drugs or alcohol altogether. Out of all of the drug addicts that I have spoken to, the majority of them say that relapse was their number one stumbling block. Just because a patient relapses does not mean that all is lost and that it is game over, or that that patient will never be able to get clean. Not at all, not even close. Let's say that you have 3 months clean from alcohol, and out of the blue, a family emergency or something that really stresses you out happens, and you reach for the bottle and have a drink. This is a relapse. However, this does not mean that you should just give up on sobriety altogether. And in fact, I picked the slogan of the Addictions podcast, Never Quit Quitting, for a reason. That reason is because relapse is not a failure. It is unfortunately a very common and very frustrating aspect of addiction. During my own opioid addiction, I relapsed more times than I can honestly remember. I mean, I know it was more than a handful of times, for sure. Now, some of my relapses happened because of outside stress issues like family emergencies, but generally, and most of the time, it was simply me making up excuses in my mind to justify using that one last time. And it's always going to be that one last time, right? You know, it's just wild how our minds can make up excuses like this and lead us right back to our drug of choice. But again, just because you have had a relapse or 2 or 3, this does not mean that it is the end. You have to take into account how long you have been addicted as well. Let's say you were an alcoholic drinking every day for 5 or 6 years, or even a decade. Okay, and with that in mind, imagine you are in week 2 of your first month of zero alcohol. As you can imagine, it would be insanely hard. You must remember that behaviors that you have developed over several years are going to take time to learn how to eliminate. Even 30 days clean after a decade of addiction, that's really barely enough to even clear the fog. Stopping substance addiction and use is hard. For some, it may even seem impossible at times, but this is simply not true. It is not impossible. Like anything else, you have to keep trying, and eventually you will make it. Some people, and even some professionals and experts out there, will tell you that relapse is a normal part of recovery from addiction. And they say this almost as if relapsing is going to happen, no matter what. And yeah, generally speaking, most patients will relapse at least once when trying to quit. But this does not mean that all patients will relapse, or that you have to relapse at least once before you can get clean. Now, believe it or not, although the majority of those fighting addiction will probably go through a relapse or 3, there are those with addictions who can make it out without relapsing at all. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, the relapse rate for most substance abuse patients is right around 60%. Now, quick question, is that number 100%? No, it is not. So just from this small amount of data here, we can clearly see that relapse is not a requirement to get to sobriety. Relapse is not the rule, is what I'm trying to say. Yes, it is common, and yes, it happens to most of us, and yes, it really sucks. But again, it is not written in stone. What is more important to remember and to really understand is that recovery from substance abuse is a lifelong healing process. It is something that you will be taking with you wherever you go and whenever you go. It is something that you must stay vigilant with. Having a relapse is just a sign that you need to reevaluate and maybe change or modify your strategy. If you or someone you know is dealing with relapse, it can be very difficult to face what has happened. But remember, do not heap or pile the blame on yourself, and also do not simply give up because of a relapse. It is so easy to think, well, this is it. I'm going downhill. I may as well dive into this pile of cocaine. But this is not true. Rather, begin by identifying the fact that you have had a relapse, and then double up or triple up on your efforts to overcome your temptations and urges. If you are sensitive to triggers, you should also identify those triggers and make efforts to avoid them. I know that triggers can come out of nowhere, and that avoiding them is sometimes easier said than done. But again, if you are dealing with a relapse, the key thing to remember above everything else is this: 3 words. Never quit quitting. I'm David Wagner, and you've been listening to Addictions. As always, I want to thank you all for listening to the Addictions podcast. You can find and listen to all of our past episodes at www.addictionspodcast.wordpress.com. Again, that's addictionspodcast.wordpress.com. For updates about the show and all sorts of other extra content like videos and crap like that, be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. I also still have quite a few stickers for anyone who leaves the Addictions podcast a review on iTunes. Just leave a review and then send me a message on Facebook with your mailing address, and I will make sure to mail you a sticker. And if you really love the show and want to help support what we do, visit www.patreon.com/addictions. Again, that's patreon.com/addictions to learn how you can help make a difference. We have some really cool extras for those who choose to support us on Patreon, so be sure and check that out. Again, I want to thank you all for listening, and never quit quitting.
Sundays you prayed Uncle John, you poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom, you got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work, the week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.